The wind swept hard across Gallatin Valley, Montana, dragging icy particles of snow in swirling currents that looked almost alive. Winter had arrived early this year, and for a man living alone in a wooden cabin at the edge of the timberline, that meant long nights and endless silence. Franklin Frank Harris, 69 years old and worn thin by life, sat in his creaking rocking chair beside the wood-burning stove. The orange glow painted lines across his face, deep grooves carved not only by age, but by decades of battles both on foreign soil and within his own mind. For most people in town, Frank was just the old veteran up in the hills, the one who came down every couple of weeks to buy flour, coffee, and the occasional bag of apples. He didn't linger at the general store, didn't sit for conversation at the diner. He kept his head low, his voice even lower, and drove back to his cabin before the small talk could pull him into places he didn't want to go. But here, in the quiet, something unexpected had broken through his walls. A soft nicker echoed from the back room. Frank sighed, a long sound that blended irritation with tenderness. All right, he muttered, pushing himself up on knees that crackled like dry sticks. He picked up the lantern from the shelf, the flame trembling inside the glass, and shuffled toward what used to be his living room. The cabin had once been simple, a front room with a stove, a bedroom, and a place for a small couch and a shelf of old army books. That had changed 6 months ago when he found the first foal abandoned by a dry creek bed. Her name was Lily, now a chestnut, with a wide white blaze down her nose. She'd been skeletal when he lifted her into the bed of his pickup, shivering so violently he thought she might seize in his arms. The local vet, Dr. Karen Whitfield, had given her slim chances, but Frank had driven home, poured every ounce of stubborn will into feeding, warming, and tending her. Somehow, against the odds, she lived. And then, as if fate wanted to test him, more came. Rusty had been left tied to a fence post outside town, a Palomino colt with eyes that seemed too knowing for his age. Shadow, the most recent, had been found in a collapsed barn, half-starved and shaking so hard it was painful to watch. 2 others in that barn hadn't made it. Shadow had survived, though fear still lingered in his every movement. Frank pushed open the makeshift stable door, inhaling the warm, earthy smell of hay that had replaced the musty odor of his once lonely cabin. The floor was layered with straw he changed out daily, and the sound of shifting hooves welcomed him like a heartbeat. Lily raised her head first, ears pricked forward. She let out a soft whicker, stepping closer with that fearless little strut that always reminded Frank of his younger self, before the war carved pieces out of him. Rusty stood near her, sturdy and bright-eyed, as though he carried a private joke only he understood. And in the farthest corner, half hidden by shadows, the bay colt remained still. Shadow, always watching, never trusting quite enough. Frank smiled faintly, pulling a couple of apple slices from his pocket. You kids are worse than my old platoon. Never a moment's patience. Lily pressed her nose against his palm, snatching the apple piece greedily. Rusty followed, careful but eager. Shadow stayed back, his large, expressive eyes flicking between Frank's hand and the hay on the ground. You'll come when you're ready, Frank said softly, placing a slice near the trough. He crouched slowly, the stiffness in his hip flaring with pain, but he stayed steady. He knew sudden moves spooked Shadow more than anything. Feeding time was a ritual that soothed Frank more than the foals realized. It gave rhythm to his days, something solid in a world that had become blurry, with too much solitude. Before Lily, Rusty, and Shadow, nights dragged on like an endless march. He'd spent decades trying to quiet the noise of memory, the jungle, the shouting, the explosions that still woke him from sleep. But with these foals, there was a different kind of noise. Nickers, hooves shifting on wood, the sound of chewing hay. It was a kind of music. Frank straightened with a groan, brushing his hands on his worn jeans. His eyes softened as he looked around the small room that no longer resembled a human living space. The old couch was gone. Shelves now held feed buckets and brushes instead of war books. The walls were reinforced with planks to withstand restless kicks. He didn't mind. Truth be told, he preferred it this way. The foals filled the silence with something worth living for. Yet, as the first heavy flakes of snow tapped against the window, worry gnawed at him. Winter in Montana wasn't forgiving. The hay he'd stored in the lean-to might last 3, maybe 4 months if rationed carefully. But foals were growing fast, appetites doubling with every week. His pension check stretched thin as it was. Dr. Whitfield had suggested he register as an official rehabilitation shelter. That way he could receive donations or maybe even state support. But the thought of government paperwork, inspections, and strangers walking into his sanctuary tied his stomach into knots. Frank had had his fill of orders and regulations. He wanted peace, not bureaucracy. He turned back toward the stove, but his knees protested with a sharp jab. "Damn hip," he muttered. He'd carried that injury since a firefight in Quang Tri, 1969. The VA clinic gave him pills when he drove into town, but he hated relying on them. Tonight, he'd just grit his teeth. Back in his chair, Frank added another log to the stove and settled down. The flames licked upward, warming his chilled fingers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. He pulled a blanket across his lap, staring into the fire until the crackle blurred into memory. For years, he had believed solitude was the only way to survive. People couldn't understand what the war had taken from him. Relationships had failed. Letters went unanswered. So he withdrew into the wilderness, into silence, into nothing. Then came Lily, then Rusty, then Shadow. For the first time in decades, he was needed. Frank leaned back, eyes heavy. His breathing slowed, and for a brief moment, peace touched him. Until he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the nicker of a foal or the settling of the old cabin wood. It was deeper, stronger. A long, resonant whinny rolled through the storm outside, followed by the heavy thud of hooves striking against frozen earth. Frank's eyes snapped open. The foals stirred in their room, hooves shuffling nervously. Lily snorted, Rusty whickered in alarm, and Shadow pressed hard against the wall. The old veteran froze, heart hammering in his chest. His instincts sharpened, the same ones that had carried him through ambushes and firefights half a century ago. He reached for the heavy flashlight hanging near the door, fingers trembling not from age but from sudden adrenaline. The wind screamed against the cabin walls. The sound came again, closer this time. Hooves, powerful and relentless, pawing at the ground right outside his door. Frank pressed a hand to the wood, feeling the vibration of something massive on the other side. "What in God's name?" he whispered. The foals cried out in fear, huddling tight together. Shadow's eyes glowed wide in the dim lantern light. Frank gripped the flashlight tighter, drawing a slow, steady breath. "Stay calm, kids," he said, though his voice carried more to himself than to them. He pulled on his old parka, every movement aching but deliberate. His boots thudded against the floor as he approached the door, the beam of the flashlight flicking across the room. Snow hissed through the cracks, carried by the gale. The air tasted of iron. Frank's heart pounded as he reached for the latch. The sound outside rose into a furious pounding hooves striking against the porch boards, loud enough to shake the frame of the cabin. The veteran braced himself, shoulders squared like a soldier readying for combat. His hand hovered over the latch. And then, silence. The kind of silence that makes the air itself hold its breath. The foals stopped moving. Even the storm seemed to pause. Frank's throat tightened. He leaned closer to the door, ears straining. And that was when a deep, guttural snort rumbled through the night, so close it felt like it was coming from the wood in front of his face. His pulse thundered. Whoever or whatever stood out there wasn't going away. The latch clicked beneath Frank Harris's trembling hand. The old parka's hood shadowed his lined face as he pushed the heavy wooden door open against the roar of the Montana blizzard. The wind clawed at him instantly, tearing snow into his eyes, stinging his weathered skin like shards of glass. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling white, a thin spear of light in a world swallowed whole by winter. And there it stood. Not 10 feet away, on the snow-laden porch, a massive black stallion loomed in the storm. Its coat was a sheen of darkness, broken only by streaks of frozen blood. Muscles rippled beneath the frost as the animal shifted, nostrils blasting steam into the frigid air. The horse was wild. There was no mistaking it, no halter marks on the face, no shoes on its hooves. Its mane was tangled, flecked with ice, and its eyes carried something almost human in their desperate intensity. Frank's stomach dropped. Wild mustangs roamed the Montana ranges, but never this close to a cabin, and never in the middle of a storm like this. They stayed with their herds, huddled together against the wind. This one was alone and badly injured. The stallion favored its right foreleg, lifting it off the ground whenever it paused. A deep gash scored its shoulder, blood frozen black against its flank. Behind Frank, the foals whickered in terror. Lily stomped her hooves, Rusty pressed against her side, and Shadow tried to make himself invisible against the far wall. Frank steadied his breathing. Instinct told him the animal was dangerous, but another part, the same stubborn part that had kept Lily alive months ago, whispered that this horse hadn't come here by accident. "You're hurt," Frank murmured, his voice low and steady, just as he used to calm soldiers on the field. "Must be real bad if you came knocking on my door." The stallion snorted, tossing his head, snow scattering from his mane. He pawed the porch boards, shaking the frame of the cabin. Frank tightened his grip on the flashlight. His mind flashed to his options: shut the door, keep the foals safe, and pray the stallion limped away, or risk everything to let it in. His body made the choice before his mind could argue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the apple slice he'd been saving for Lily's morning treat. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand into the icy air. The stallion's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring. Hunger battled fear in its gaze. It lowered its massive head, inch by inch, until warm breath fogged Frank's palm. Lips brushed the apple. The horse took it, chewing, never breaking eye contact. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His free hand rose, cautious, toward the stallion's muzzle. He expected a flinch, maybe even a rear, but the horse held steady. His calloused fingers pressed against the velvet of its nose. For one fragile second, trust bridged the divide between wild and tame. Behind him, Lily let out a sharp cry, breaking the spell. The stallion jerked, nearly knocking Frank back. The old veteran staggered, pain flaring in his hip. "Easy," he hissed, steadying himself. His military instincts took over calm, low voice, controlled movements. "Easy, boy, you're all right." With the speed of a medic under fire, Frank reached for the small syringe tucked in his coat pocket. Dr. Whitfield had left it months ago for emergencies with the foals. It wasn't meant for a stallion this size, but it might take the edge off just enough to let him treat the wounds. "Gonna sting a little?" Frank muttered, teeth clamping the cap as he drove the needle into the thick muscle of the horse's neck. The stallion flinched, eyes flashing white, but he didn't bolt. Maybe the storm had already drained him. Maybe desperation had dulled his fight. Frank stroked the horse's neck as the sedative seeped in. "That's it. You're safe now. Let's get you warm." He tugged gently on the rope he'd looped, guiding the stallion toward the doorway. The foals scattered into the corners, ears flat, eyes wide. The stallion hesitated at the threshold. Its chest rose and fell with labored breaths. Its gaze flicked from Frank to the firelight within the cabin. "Come on," Frank urged. One step at a time. The horse obeyed. When its hooves struck the wooden floor, the entire cabin seemed to shift. A storm-scarred veteran and a wounded king of the wild stood under the same roof, and the fragile piece of Frank's sanctuary tilted toward chaos. For the next hour, Frank worked like a field medic again. His hands remembered the motions: clean the gash with warm water, pack it with antiseptic, wrap tight with cloth strips cut from an old army blanket. The stallion swayed, head drooping as the sedative numbed the fire in his veins. Frank spoke softly as he worked, voice threading the silence. "I once patched up a buddy in '69, jungle so thick you couldn't see the Sunday. He'd taken shrapnel in the shoulder, right where you're bleeding. I kept him alive 4 days before they found us. Don't know if it was luck or stubbornness." He paused, eyes meeting the stallion's. "Guess you might know something about stubbornness." The stallion flicked an ear, breath fogging in the firelight. When Frank finally stepped back, sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cold. His hip throbbed, but the work was done for now. "You'll need a name," he murmured, studying the jagged white scar on the stallion's forehead. It looked like a lightning strike frozen in hair. "Storm fits you, doesn't it?" The horse blinked slowly, as if in agreement. The foals began to creep closer, curiosity outweighing fear. Lily stepped first, neck stretched, nostrils flaring. Storm lowered his head slightly, not in aggression but in acknowledgement. "Easy, girl," Frank said, though he didn't interfere. The air hummed with tension as Lily and Storm stood nose to nose. For a breathless moment, the cabin was silent except for the storm outside. Then, Lily nickered softly, the same sound she gave Frank when she wanted comfort. Storm exhaled, a warm plume of air across her muzzle. Frank's throat tightened. They're speaking the same language, he thought. And maybe, just maybe, they're healing each other too. Hours passed. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. Storm dozed fitfully by the fire, bandages glowing white against his black coat. The foals huddled together nearby, still wary but no longer trembling. Frank lowered himself into his chair, every joint screaming in protest. He poured coffee from the enamel pot, hands shaking so badly he nearly spilled. He studied the scene before him, disbelief mingling with awe. In less than a day, his cabin had transformed from a refuge for 3 fragile foals into something else entirely: a battlefield, a sanctuary, a strange new family. But peace was never meant to last. As the fire burned low, a sudden crack shook the cabin, not the usual groan of settling logs. Louder, sharper. Lightning split the night sky, its brilliance searing through the frosted windows. A thunderclap followed, deafening, rattling dishes off the shelves. Storm's eyes flew wide. He lurched to his feet, muscles surging with panic, hooves striking the wooden floor like drumbeats of war. The foals bolted into corners, squealing in fear. Frank dropped his cup, hot coffee scalding his hand, but he didn't flinch. His instincts sharpened again, heart pounding with the rhythm of combat. "Easy," he shouted over the storm, his voice steady, though his body screamed with pain. Storm reared, hooves pawing the air dangerously close to Lily. Frank moved without thinking. Frank's voice started low, rough as gravel, the way an old riverbed holds the echo of water long after the flood is gone. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The black stallion froze, front hooves suspended for a breathless heartbeat, head towering in the cramped cabin. Lightning flared through the frosted panes. Thunder rolled a half-beat later, shaking the coffee cups and rattling the iron stove door. Lily's small chestnut body trembled beside Frank's leg. Rusty pressed himself into the corner. Shadow went still in that way prey animals do, when flight is impossible and the only option left is faith. Frank didn't stop singing. That saved a wretch like me. He eased one palm up, fingers open, posture small but steady. Years ago, in the jungle, he'd learned how stillness can disarm more than force. The stallion's eyes, wild, white-rimmed, tracked the rise of that hand. The sedative still feathered through his blood, not enough to dull the fear, just enough to keep it from blowing the roof off the night. I once was lost, but now am found. Storm's hooves thudded back onto the floorboards. A shiver rippled along his massive shoulders, the bandage on his foreleg twitching with the movement. He snorted, a surge of hot air in the 20-degree cabin, then cocked one ear toward Frank like a weather vane searching for true north. Was blind, but now I see. Outside, the wind raked the porch, loose boards clattering like bones on a string. The stove's heat pushed 5 feet out. Beyond that, the air carried a thin blade of cold. A drift had already grown against the door, snow piling high and mean. Frank could feel the aching ache in his hip hot, insistent his pulse out of rhythm with the storm. "Easy, boy," he murmured between lines, voice folding back into the hymn. "You're okay, we're okay." Lily took a step, then another, her small hooves clicking. She stretched her nose toward Storm's shoulder and exhaled. Not a challenge, a greeting. The stallion's ears flicked. He lowered his head inches, just enough to prove he'd heard her. Frank risked one more move. He reached until his fingertips touched the velvet at Storm's muzzle. Warmth met warmth. The horse didn't pull away. A long moment passed, the kind of thin-threaded peace a man learns not to breathe too loudly in, for fear of snapping it. Frank stayed where he was, singing the second verse now, the words slipping out of old memory like a key fitting a lock. "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved." Something in the stallion softened. His barrel stopped heaving. The crown of his head dipped toward Frank's shoulder. The smell of horse earth and winter and sweat washed over the old man, and a knot he'd kept tucked inside since 1969 loosened just enough to let the next breath in without pain. "Good," Frank whispered, letting the song fade into a humming lull, then into silence. "Good boy." Rusty's ears crept forward, Shadow's hindquarters unglued from the wall. The wind still battered the cabin, but inside, the storm surrendered a little ground. Frank didn't move for a long beat. Then, slow as frost forming, he stepped sideways so that his body shielded Lily. He tested Storm's bandage, then the swelling at the fetlock 2 fingers, firm but kind. Storm flinched, but he didn't strike. When the stove popped and sparkled, the horse lifted his head, then settled again, breathing steady. "Let's set you up," Frank said, voice a rasp and a promise. He pulled an extra quilt from the trunk, folded it double, and laid it near the stove's reach. He spread fresh straw in a thicker ring, 4 inches deep, maybe 6 enough cushion for a big animal on hurt legs. He topped off water, then rationed a small scoop of pellets. Starved horses can founder on good intentions. Dr. Whitfield's warning lived behind every decision tonight. Storm watched all of it, eyes never fully leaving the old man. When Frank backed away, palms open, the stallion limped forward and lowered himself with a careful, awkward grace that felt like a benediction. The cabin exhaled with him. Frank finally let the tremor in his hands shake out. He flexed his burnt palm, the coffee spill would blister by morning, and settled Lily where she'd feel the heat without crowding their visitor. Rusty drifted to her side. Shadow hung on the rim of light, thinking it over the way he always did. "Come on, kid," Frank said, glancing at the bay foal. "No heroes tonight, just breathing." The storm raged on. Minutes ticked like nails, tapping the window. Frank sat on the floor with his back to the chair, the rockers nudging his shoulder blades. He pulled the blanket over his knees and let his head thump against wood. Pain pulsed at his hip in hot, timed bursts, every 8 seconds or so. He counted them for a while, then lost count. He must have drifted, because when he opened his eyes, the lantern wick had burned low, and a quieter dark had crept into the corners. The snow's hiss had softened from a scream to a steady whisper. The stove radiated a buttery heat that smelled like pine sap and old iron, and there, 3 feet away, a huge dark body lay curved like a parenthesis between the Foals and the door. Storm had turned himself into a wall. Frank smiled without meaning to, a small, private thing. "Look at you," he said into the half-sleeping room. "Fortress." He tried to stand to add a split log. His hip disagreed. The pain stung up his spine and snapped bright behind his eyes. He gasped, reached instinctively, and found coarse hair under his palm. Storm was there, close enough that Frank could use his shoulder to lever himself up. The horse didn't flinch. He just breathed. That was all. He breathed, slow and sure, and with the patience of the old world. "Thank you," Frank said, the words surprising them both. He fed the stove, checked the bandage one more time, then slid back down. Lily stirred, nosed Frank's sleeve, and settled with a sigh that sounded like a child unburdening. Rusty shifted so that his flank touched her shoulder. Shadow crept an inch nearer and stopped, as if 1 inch was all the courage he had for tonight, and he was choosing to spend it. Frank tucked the blanket higher, until it covered the ache in his ribs he never talked about. He watched the horse's ribs rise and fall. For a long time, that was enough. He thought about the number of inches the snow might stack against his door by dawn, 6, 8, maybe more. He thought about the last time someone had sat this close to him while he slept, and couldn't remember when that had been. He thought about the song he hadn't sung since he buried a friend whose dog tags he could still recite by heart. He didn't notice he was crying until one tear warmed a track down his cheek and disappeared into his beard. He let the second one fall without wiping it away. "Grace," he said to the ceiling, as if the word itself might light a lamp there. He slept. Morning came blue and brittle, the kind of Montana light that makes edges. Frost-painted ferns on the windows. The stove held a red heart of coals. The wind had lost its teeth, but the cold had not. When Frank moved, his hip announced itself like a bad neighbor banging on the wall. Storm was awake. So were the Foals. For a half-second, the room held that fragile hush that comes before a decision. The stallion's ears tilted forward. He pushed himself upright, slow, careful to keep weight off the bad leg, then stood square and tall. His head turned toward the small window where dawn silvered the drifted world. He looked at it a long time, and Frank watched him looking. "All right," Frank said softly, reading that gaze the way he'd learned to read weather and grief. "Door's there. Your Storm or mine?" Lily stepped between them, bold as always. She bumped Storm's foreleg with her nose and blew a tiny burst of steam. Rusty snuck in for his own sniff, then pretended he hadn't. Shadow took 2 brave steps and froze. Storm lowered his muzzle to Lily's forehead and rested it there. Something unwound in Frank's chest at the sight, an invisible knot letting go of a loop. If animals pray, it looks like that, he thought, and it didn't scare him the way prayer used to. He got the satellite phone from the shelf and thumbed the power. The battery indicator blinked yellow. He'd have to ration calls. He scrolled to Dr. Whitfield's number and hesitated. If the roads were buried, she couldn't come today anyway. But her voice might help him steady the day before it ran away with him. The phone crackled to life, searching for the slice of sky it needed to find the world beyond these trees. "Come on," Frank said, as if the little gray box could be sweet-talked. "Just a minute of mercy." Storm's head whipped to the sound, alert but not panicked. Lily leaned into Frank's knee. The phone found a bar, then lost it, then found it again, a stuttering heartbeat of connection. "Hold, hold, hold," Frank coaxed. The ring shot through. Once. Twice. "Whitfield," came the voice, thin with distance, warm with recognition. "Frank? You holding up?" He laughed, and it surprised him. "You could say that." He gave her the quick version: Storm, stallion, wounds, sedative, the hymn he hadn't planned on singing. She asked clean, professional questions. He answered. She said the county plows were trying the back road by late afternoon. No promises. Keep the feed small and frequent. Keep the leg clean. And her voice softened here. "Keep yourself upright, Harris." "I'll do my best," he said, truth and bravado arm wrestling in the syllables. He clicked off and set the phone down like a fragile bird. The room felt different now, less alone, more accountable. Outside, the light multiplied. Inside, the day began to ask for choices. Frank shuffled to the door. He rested his palm on the latch. The drift pushed back, heavy and insistent. He cracked it an inch, then 2. Cold sliced in, sharp enough to taste. The world beyond was a white ocean, smooth, endless, interrupted only by the dark ribbon of pine and the naked ribs of split-rail fence. Storm went still, every line of him listening. You can go if you need to, Frank said. Not a dare. A benediction. I won't stop you. He opened the door wider. Snow fell inward in a slow, soft collapse, piling in a fan across the threshold. The stallion took one tentative step forward until his breath touched the cold, until he could see the drift and the distance and the cut of the mountains. His muscles lifted and set, like the first notes of a song deciding what key to choose. Frank's hand found the back of the chair. Lily pressed so close her whiskers tickled his jeans. Rusty's ear brushed his shin. Shadow stood where he always did when decisions were being made close enough to matter, far enough to run if the world broke in half. Storm shifted his weight. He did not cross the threshold. Not yet. The sound came again. A sharp crack, distant but unmistakable. Not thunder. Not the groan of an old tree bowing to ice. Frank froze by the door, fingers still resting on the latch. Storm stood like a statue, every muscle taut beneath the bandages, ears swiveling with the precision of a radar dish. Lily pressed against Frank's leg, her small frame vibrating with nerves. Rusty's head lifted, nostrils flaring. Shadow had already retreated into the corner, eyes rolling white. The Montana wilderness carried its own language, one Frank had learned to translate over decades of lonely winters. But this didn't fit the vocabulary of wind and snow. Too clean, he muttered under his breath. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, swallowed by the hush of morning. Too sharp. He strained his ears. The storm outside had quieted, its rage spent in the night. In its place, a heavy stillness blanketed the valley, which made the noise stand out even more. Another crack. This time, closer. Like weight moving across ice or wood splitting under pressure. Storm pawed the cabin floor, head swinging toward the door. His breath poured out in short bursts, fogging the glass. He was listening too, and whatever he heard had set fire to his instincts. Easy, Frank said softly, though his own heart hammered. His hip throbbed with each pulse, a metronome of pain. We don't spook until we know. He nudged the door open a few inches more. The cold cut across his face, raw and bright, carrying scents of pine, snow, and something else metallic, foreign. The drift outside glowed silver in the morning light. The sky had cleared to an endless blue, the kind that promised both beauty and danger. Snow lay smooth, unbroken, until his eyes caught it. Tracks. Wide, heavy tracks stamped into the drift, curving along the tree line and angling toward his cabin. Frank's throat tightened. He hadn't seen another person in weeks, and yet someone or something was close enough to leave a trail. He let the door fall shut, his hand trembling against the latch. Storm snorted, restless, sensing the change in his keeper's heartbeat. "All right," Frank muttered, more to himself than to the animals. "We play this careful." He stoked the stove, the familiar motions steadying his nerves. The foals settled slowly, though their ears still twitched at every small sound. Storm stayed near the window, massive body angled toward the door like a sentinel on duty. Frank poured himself a tin cup of coffee, ignoring the ache in his hip. He sipped, the bitterness grounding him. He glanced at the rifle mounted above the hearth. He hadn't touched it in years, not since he swore off needing the weight of a weapon in his hands. But the tracks outside stirred instincts that had never fully gone dormant. He rose with a grunt, lifted the rifle down, and checked the chamber. Clean. Loaded. The sound of the bolt sliding home echoed too loud in the small cabin. "Just in case," he said, though part of him hated the feel of it. Storm's ears flicked at the metallic click, and for a second, Frank saw his own unease mirrored in the stallion's dark eyes. The hours crept by. Sun climbed higher, turning the snow into a dazzling mirror. Frank busied himself with chores, changing Storm's bandage, rationing hay, refilling water. Every few minutes he glanced at the window, half expecting a shadow to move across the drift, but nothing came. By noon, the silence had grown heavier than the storm. Frank finally decided he needed to see for himself. He bundled into his parka, pulled on boots stiff with frost, and reached for the door. "Just a look," he told the animals. "Won't be long." Storm stamped a hoof, ears pinned, as if warning him. Frank hesitated. "You might be smarter than me," he admitted, "but I've got to know." He pushed into the cold. The sunlight nearly blinded him. Snow stretched in every direction, brilliant and merciless. The tracks stood out, deep impressions leading from the north woods straight toward his porch. He crouched, ignoring the scream in his hip, and touched the nearest print. Not boots, not hooves, snowshoes. Someone was walking the back country with intent, close enough to stumble right onto his isolated sanctuary. He straightened, breath fogging. His cabin wasn't on any trail. Nobody came out here without a reason. The wind carried a sound faint, but sharp enough to cut through silence. A whistle. 3 notes, high and clear. Frank's blood ran cold. That wasn't nature. That was signal. He turned back toward the cabin, every instinct roaring to move faster. Inside, Storm was pacing, nostrils wide. The Foals whickered nervously, picking up on his tension. Frank shut the door hard, bolted it, and leaned his forehead against the wood. "Not today," he muttered. "Not like this." He set the rifle within reach of his chair, poured another black coffee he didn't want. And Saturday, his hip burned. His heart refused to slow. Storm finally stopped pacing and fixed him with a look. Not fear, expectation. "You're telling me something," Frank whispered. "But I don't speak your language." Outside, the silence stretched again. The whistle did not repeat. The tracks remained, burned into his mind. As dusk bled across the sky, the world turned violet and silver. Frank lit the kerosene lamp, its glow a fragile bubble against the deepening dark. He checked Storm's wound healing, but still raw, and rubbed Lily's forehead until her eyes fluttered shut. He tried to quiet his thoughts, but every creak of the cabin boards made him tense. Every gust of wind whispered of a presence just beyond sight. Finally, exhaustion dragged him toward sleep. He pulled the blanket to his chest and leaned back in his chair. The rifle rested within arm's reach. Storm stood sentinel, his shadow stretched long in the lamplight. For the first time since Vietnam, Frank admitted he was afraid of what the night might bring. Frank Harris sat in the dark, the rifle balanced across his knees. His heart hadn't slowed since the shadow passed the frosted window. Even in Vietnam, he had hated waiting nights where silence stretched so long it felt like the jungle itself was holding its breath before breaking loose with gunfire. Tonight had that same taste. Storm shifted near the door, his weight pressing grooves into the wooden floor. His ears twitched at every gust of wind, every pop from the stove. The Foals huddled in their straw bed, wide-eyed, too frightened to lie down. Frank's gaze kept slipping to the door. He could still hear it, the crunch of boots on snow, steady, deliberate. Not a hunter, not a ranger. Someone who'd come straight to his cabin in the middle of nowhere, where nobody was supposed to come. The minutes crawled until exhaustion pried his eyes shut. But even in sleep, his hand stayed curled around the rifle's stock. The morning light was cruel, bright against the storm's ruins. Snow covered the world in a white silence, except for one thing: tracks. Frank squinted through the frostbitten window. The prince circled his cabin like a predator sizing prey, then veered toward the tree line. He cursed under his breath. He'd seen the sign of men stalking before different jungles, same language. Someone was out there, he muttered, tugging on his parka. Storm whinnied sharply as Frank reached for the door. The stallion's eyes locked on him, warning in every line of his body. "Easy," Frank told him. "I won't go far." But the truth was, he had to know. The air hit like knives when he stepped outside. His boots sank 6 inches into the drift, crunching against the crust of ice beneath. The tracks were fresh, clearer in daylight than they had been last night. Wide print snowshoes. Whoever it was knew how to travel winter country. Frank crouched, knees protesting. He brushed snow from the edge of one track, exposing a smear of dark brown frozen into the ice. Blood. His pulse kicked. He followed the trail a dozen yards into the trees before stopping. The forest was silent, too silent. The prince went deeper, toward a ravine where shadows lay heavy even in daylight. His gut told him he'd be a fool to follow farther. He turned back, scanning the ridgeline. Nothing moved, no smoke, no voices, just the stillness of a land that swallowed mistakes whole. But when he reached his porch again, his boot struck something half buried by drifting snow. A glove. Black leather, stiff with ice, sliced open across the palm. He turned it over and found a crust of dried blood inside. Frank tucked it into his pocket and forced himself back inside, where the warmth hit like a wave. Storm pawed the floorboards when he saw him, nostrils flaring as if he could smell the foreign scent clinging to the glove. "Yeah," Frank said, laying the rifle on the table. "We're not alone out here." The day dragged. He tried to settle back into routine fresh hay for the foals, another poultice on Storm's swollen leg, but unease clung to him. Every creak of timber set his nerves on edge. The satellite phone blinked its feeble light. He tried Dr. Whitfield's number twice, but the signal flickered and died before it rang through. "No cavalry coming," he muttered. Storm refused to rest. The stallion kept circling the cabin, stopping every so often to stare at the window like he expected something to be there. The foals picked up his unease, bunching together, ears flicking. Frank's hip ached as the hours stretched. He poured himself black coffee, but it tasted like rust. By evening, the sun bled orange over the ridge, and the shadows grew long across the snow. Frank barred the door with an extra log and lowered the lamp wick until the cabin sat in dim glow. He wanted to believe the stranger had moved on, but men who circled cabins in the dark rarely gave up. It was near midnight when the first crash came. The door shook on its hinges. The foals squealed, scattering. Storm reared, slamming his hooves against the planks. Frank snatched the rifle, adrenaline burning through the fog of fatigue. "Who's there?" he shouted, voice raw but steady. A pause, then a voice, deep, rough. "Open up, old man." Frank's stomach twisted. Not the same voice he'd heard last night. This one carried menace, not caution. "Get off my land," Frank barked. "Now." The response was another slam, harder, rattling the frame. Storm screamed, ears flat, muscles straining against fear and fury. Frank aimed the rifle square at the door. His hand shook, but his eye was iron. "One more hit and I drop you where you stand." Silence. Then, the crunch of footsteps retreating into the snow. Frank didn't lower the rifle until the sound faded into the forest. The foals trembled in their corner. Storm stood in the center of the cabin, chest heaving, watching Frank like they shared the same thought. It isn't over. He didn't sleep after that. Every muscle locked tight, every nerve strung thin. He sat with the rifle across his lap, staring at the door until the black outside began to lighten with gray. By dawn, the world looked the same snowdrifts and pines, but Frank knew better. Someone out there had found him, and now they knew his cabin held more than firewood and feed. They had tested the door once. They'd be back. The whisper coiled through the cabin walls like smoke. "Frank Harris, we know what you've got in there." Frank's breath caught in his throat. Storm's head snapped toward the sound, ears locked forward. The foals pressed tighter together in their straw, trembling, their eyes wide and white in the dim lamp glow. They knew his name. Frank tightened his grip on the rifle, the wood pressing into his scarred palm. Nobody should know him out here. He hadn't been in town for nearly 3 months, hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to anyone but Dr. Whitfield. So, how the hell? He forced his voice steady. "Show yourself," he barked into the silence. "You want something, speak plain." Nothing, just the faint groan of wind through the eaves. He moved to the window, rifle angled, hips screaming with each step. He squinted into the white glow of early morning. Nothing stirred. Just endless snow, trees bent under ice, the mountains, a steel shadow in the distance. But he knew what he'd heard. He wasn't losing his mind. Hours crept by, like molasses poured in January. Frank kept the rifle across his lap as he stoked the stove, as he checked Storm's bandage, as he fed Lily, Rusty, and Shadow. The horses ate nervously, ears twitching at every creak. Storm hardly touched his hay. He paced, restless, a sentinel in a prison made of snow and silence. Frank tried the satellite phone again. Dead. No signal, not even a flicker. He slammed it back into the cradle, muttering curses too old and tired to carry heat. By mid-morning, the sky bruised gray again. Snow fell soft, powdery, almost gentle compared to the blizzard 2 nights ago. But Frank's skin prickled. This quiet wasn't peace, it was pressure. The kind that builds before something breaks. Near noon, the sound came again. Not a whisper this time. A voice, clear and cold, from just outside the door. "You've got something that belongs to us, Harris. Hand over the stallion, and we walk away." Storm lunged against the cabin wall with a furious whinny, shaking the timbers. The foals scattered. Frank's chest went tight. "Belongs to you?" he shouted, rage crackling through his fear. "He's no man's property. He came here half dead, and I damn well saved him." Laughter. 2 voices, maybe 3. Male, rough. One younger, sharper, mocking. "You think you saved him? Old man, you don't know what you've got. That horse is worth more than everything in that shack put together. Give him up, and maybe we don't burn this place down with you in it." Frank's blood chilled. Storm wasn't just a wild stallion that stumbled into his care. He was something else, something wanted. The men's voices faded, crunching snow as they moved off. Frank sagged against the wall, his hip throbbing, rifle still clutched in his hand. He glanced at Storm. The stallion's dark eyes burned, wild and furious, but not afraid. He seemed to understand every word. "Storm," Frank whispered. "What the hell did you run from?" The rest of the day was a siege of silence. Frank kept every bolt drawn, every crack stuffed with cloth to keep the cold and the whispers out. But his mind wouldn't stop circling. Who were these men? Rustlers? Ranchers who thought they had a claim on the Mustangs in the hills? Or something darker, something tied to that bloody glove he'd found in the drift? By dusk, exhaustion gnawed at his bones. The foals finally settled, lulled by the steady hiss of snow against the roof. Storm stood guard near the door, tail swishing in sharp jerks, nostrils flaring at every sound. Frank lowered himself into his chair, the rifle across his lap, kerosene lamp burning low. His eyelids sagged despite the danger clawing at the edges of the night. He told himself he'd only rest them for a moment. The crash of splitting wood tore him awake. The door. The bottom hinge screamed as something slammed against it. Snow blew in through a new crack, cold and sharp. The foals shrieked, bolting into corners. Storm reared, hooves striking sparks against the cabin floor. Frank snapped the rifle up, aiming at the door. His hip burned like fire, but his arms were steady. "Try it, you bastards," he growled. "One step through, and I'll drop you where you stand." For a moment, silence. Then a voice, calm, almost amused. "You won't shoot, Harris. You need both hands to keep that old hip of yours from giving out. How long before you can't get up from that chair at all?" Frank's chest squeezed. They weren't guessing. They knew. "Who the hell are you?" he roared. The only answer was another slam against the door. The wood bowed, but held. Storm lunged, teeth snapping at the air, a scream tearing from his throat. The cabin shook with his fury. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped. Footsteps retreated into the snow, fading into the storm's whisper. Frank lowered the rifle an inch, then another. His shoulders sagged. His body trembled with the effort of standing against the night. But Storm didn't relax. He pressed his body against the door, ears sharp, muscles tense as steel cables. "They'll be back," Frank whispered, voice raw. "And next time, they won't just knock." He stayed awake until dawn, the rifle across his knees, the fire a dim glow. Every creak of the timbers felt like a clock ticking down. The foals lay curled tight, too exhausted to tremble anymore. Storm never moved from his post at the door. When the first light spilled through the frost, Frank hauled himself upright with a groan. His hip had locked overnight. It took 3 tries to straighten. He shuffled to the window, brushing frost aside with a shaking hand. The tracks were everywhere. Dozens of them. Snowshoe prints circling, pacing, weaving between the trees. Not 2 men, not 3. At least half a dozen. Frank's stomach sank. They hadn't just stumbled on him. They'd come prepared. Storm pressed his head against Frank's shoulder, a heavy weight of heat and breath. The old man lifted a trembling hand to stroke his muzzle. "Looks like it's you and me, partner," he murmured, "but I'll be damned if I hand you over." The engines shattered the morning silence. Low at first, like bees humming against glass, then swelling until the walls of the cabin seemed to vibrate with the roar. Frank clutched the satellite phone tighter, Sarah's voice breaking through the static. "Frank, did you hear me? The line died. The bar blinked out. Just static. Damn it!" Frank slammed the phone onto the table. His hip screamed as he lurched toward the door, rifle already in his grip. Storm shrieked, a piercing call that rattled the shutters. He pawed the floor, eyes blazing. The foals pressed back into the straw, trembling, their tiny breaths puffing in unison. The engines circled now, weaving in and out of earshot, not charging, not retreating, testing, like wolves padding around a campfire, waiting for a weak spot. Frank drew the bolt tighter on the door. "All right, Harris," he muttered, voice low. "You've been here before. You hold the line until daylight shifts the odds." Snow crunched outside boots, dismounting from machines. Voices carried, muffled but close. "Not yet. Circle the back. He's old. He can't hold out long." Frank's stomach nodded. Whoever these men were, they knew more about him than strangers should. He shuffled to the window and peered through the frost. Shapes moved in the trees, dark figures against the white, at least 6, maybe more. One broke from the group and stepped into the clearing. A tall man in a heavy parka, snow clinging to his beard, his gloved hands cupped around his mouth. "Harris!" the man called. His voice was smooth, too smooth, cutting across the snow like a salesman at a county fair. "We don't want trouble, just the stallion. Give him over, and you walk away clean." Storm screamed again, slamming his hooves into the floorboards, as if he understood every word. Frank raised the rifle and shouted back, "You'll get him over my dead body." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "That can be arranged." The next hours blurred into a standoff. The men circled, shouted, tested the cabin's defenses. Twice they pounded on the door. Once a bullet cracked the air, punching a hole through the upper window. Glass rained across the floor. The foals squealed, bolting to the far wall. Storm reared, hooves flailing. Frank fired back through the shattered glass, his shot echoing across the valley. Snow exploded off a pine trunk where one of the figures had been. Silence followed. Then laughter. "You still shoot straight, old man, but how many rounds you got left?" Frank swallowed hard. His ammo box sat half empty in the drawer. Not enough for a siege. He sank into his chair, chest heaving, rifle across his knees. His hip throbbed so fiercely he could barely think. Storm stood guard at the door, tail swishing, ears pinned. "This isn't just rustlers," Frank muttered under his breath. "This is something bigger, something Storm brought with him." By dusk, the storm clouds returned, swallowing the horizon. Snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, muting the world to a hush. The engines went silent, but Frank knew better than to think they were gone. He fed the foals what little hay he dared spare, checked Storm's bandage, then lowered the lamp wick. Shadows swallowed the cabin, his ears strained for every crunch outside. When the first knock came, it was almost polite. 3 sharp raps against the door, Frank's blood iced. A voice followed, calm, deliberate. "Frank Harris, you've got one chance. Open the door, give us the stallion, and no one gets hurt." Storm pressed his bulk against the wood, answering with a savage scream. Frank gritted his teeth. Not today. He cocked the rifle. The reply was a hiss of gasoline pouring against the cabin wall. The sharp, unmistakable stench filled the air. Frank's heart stopped. "Next time," the voice drawled, "we light the match." Inside, panic broke like thunder. The foals cried, Storm pawed frantically, the cabin trembling with their fear. Frank's chest heaved as he shuffled to the door, pressing his forehead against the wood. "They'll burn us alive," he whispered. His knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. Storm turned his head, fixing Frank with a look dark, burning, unyielding. "You're not mine to give away," Frank said hoarsely. "But how in God's name do I fight fire with nothing but wood and snow?" He staggered to the stove, shoveled hot embers into a bucket, then thought better of it. Too risky, too desperate. He grabbed the water barrels instead, dragging them closer to the door, his joints screaming with every step. All the while, his mind replayed the voice outside, cold and confident. They weren't bluffing. They'd torch everything, him, the foals, Storm, just to get what they wanted. Night deepened. The men didn't return, but their silence pressed heavier than their voices. Frank kept the rifle close, every muscle wound tight. He knew this was the calm before the next strike. The foals finally collapsed in exhaustion, curled together in the straw. Storm stood over them like a sentry, eyes glinting in the lamplight. Frank sat in his chair, every joint throbbing, heart refusing to rest. At some point, exhaustion pulled him under. He woke to the smell of smoke. His eyes shot open. The air shimmered, thick and acrid. The foals coughed, their cries sharp. Storm screamed, rearing, his hooves striking sparks against the floor. Frank lurched upright, rifle clattering to the ground. He staggered to the door and ripped it open. Flames licked at the cabin's outer wall, devouring the driftwood stacked nearby. Shadows of men danced in the tree line, their torches flaring bright. "Time's up, Harris," one shouted. "Hand him over, or you all burn." Frank's throat closed. Firelight painted the snow crimson, smoke clawed the sky, and the foals cried in terror. Storm bellowed, fury and fear twisting into one sound that split the night. Frank raised the rifle, his old body shaking with rage. "You want him?" he roared. "Come through me first!" The night was torn in two. On one side, fire licked at the cabin wall, snapping and crackling as if eager to devour dry pine. On the other, headlights pierced the snow, bouncing across the rutted road as Sarah Whitfield's truck fought its way down the valley. And above, like wolves spilling from the tree line, a dozen more torches burned on the ridge, their glow stretching long shadows across the snow. Frank Harris gripped his rifle so tight his knuckles went bone white. His lungs burned from smoke, his hips screamed, but his voice was steel. "You picked the wrong ranch, boys." The men below laughed, their shadows flickering monstrous against the fire. One stepped forward, face hidden under a fur-lined hood. "You can't fight us all, Harris, not for long. That stallion is coming with us." Storm screamed, rearing in the doorway, his black coat glowing with the firelight, muscles bunching like a storm cloud ready to break. Behind him, Lily, Rusty, and Shadow huddled, their terrified cries slicing through the roar of flame. Frank's chest tightened. He had fought wars, lost friends, buried family, but this was the line he could not let anyone cross. The fire caught the porch beam, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Heat blasted through the open doorway, forcing Frank to shield his face. He stumbled back, coughing hard, and shouted, "Buckets, water," though there was no one but him to answer. Storm lunged against the doorframe, nostrils flaring, as if he meant to hurl himself into the blaze. Frank grabbed a fistful of mane, pulling hard. "No, stay back!" The stallion fought him, furious and wild, but Frank held on, hips screaming with the effort. Finally, Storm settled, stamping the floor so hard dust shook from the rafters. Frank dragged the water barrel forward, sloshing icy spray onto the flames. Steam hissed, clouding the doorway. For a moment, the fire dimmed, but the men outside howled, throwing more fuel onto the blaze. Flames leapt higher, and then salvation cut through smoke and fire. The growl of Sarah's truck engine surged louder, headlights blazing across the clearing. Tires spun in the snow, throwing up white arcs as the truck skidded to a halt. Sarah jumped from the cab, bundled in a heavy coat, her red hair catching the firelight. She clutched a shotgun, eyes blazing. "Frank, are you in there?" Frank staggered into view, coughing, rifle raised. "Sarah, stay back! Too many!" She fired into the air, the boom echoing across the valley. The men flinched, their torches wavering. For a heartbeat, hope pierced the night. But then the ridge moved. The line of torches began to descend, more than Frank had dared imagine. 15, 20, maybe more. Their chanting voices rolled down the slope, carried by the wind, hungry and sure. Frank's knees nearly buckled. "Lord above!" Sarah swung her shotgun toward the ridge. "Who the hell are they?" Frank's voice cracked. "Don't know, don't care, but they want him." He jerked his chin toward Storm. As if on cue, the stallion screamed again, hooves striking sparks, his fury unearthly. The men on the ridge answered with a roar, torches burning brighter against the snow. Sarah darted to the porch, pumping another shell into the shotgun. "We can't hold this, Frank. Not alone." Frank coughed smoke, steadied his rifle. "We don't run, not while they're breathing." She stared at him, then at the foals trembling behind Storm. "Then we buy time. You still got that old trail behind the cabin?" Frank nodded, though the thought of running stabbed his pride. "Leads to the canyon. But the snow, better than burning alive." A fresh crash shook the cabin. A torch smashed through a window, flames spilling onto the floor. The foals squealed, scattering. Storm lunged, teeth snapping, nearly colliding with Frank in his fury. "Get them out!" Sarah shouted. "Now!" Frank grabbed Lily's halter, dragging her toward the back door. Rusty and Shadow followed, wide-eyed. Sarah fought the flames with her coat, stomping, shouting curses into the smoke. Storm hesitated, staring at the inferno eating the front wall. His body shook with rage, with refusal. "Storm!" Frank bellowed. His voice cracked, raw with smoke and pain. "With me!" The stallion's ears flicked back. For a breathless second, Frank thought he'd lose him to the fire. But then Storm lunged, following the foals through the back. The snow swallowed them whole. The night air was knives, but it was cleaner than the smoke. Frank stumbled through the drift, rifle over his shoulder, the foals crying behind him. Sarah crashed out after them, shotgun raised. Behind them, the cabin roared. Flames consumed the porch, shooting sparks into the sky. Shadows of men swarmed around it, torches flaring, their voices lifting in a savage chant. Sarah grabbed Frank's arm. "Trail now!" Frank forced his aching body into motion. The canyon path cut through the trees, narrow and steep. Snow piled knee-deep, slowing every step. The foals floundered, squealing. Storm pushed them forward, his massive body cutting a path. The chanting grew louder, closer. Torches bobbed through the trees, weaving like fireflies of war. "Faster!" Sarah urged. She fired behind them, the shotgun blast splitting the night. A scream followed, then silence. Frank turned his head, just long enough to see a figure fall into the snow. But 3 more shadows replaced him, torches burning hotter. "They won't stop," Frank rasped. His breath plumed in ragged bursts. His hip felt like it was splitting bone from bone. Storm screamed again, rearing high, his hooves slamming into a torch-bearing figure that had cut them off. The man crumpled, torch snuffed in the snow. The stallion charged forward, driving the foals ahead, his black body glowing against the snowlight. For one terrible, glorious moment, Frank saw him for what he was, not just a wild horse, but a king, unbroken, unstoppable. "Go!" Frank shouted. "He's showing the way." The canyon loomed a jagged cut in the land, its frozen stream glittering under the moon. The trail narrowed to a knife edge. Sarah shoved Rusty forward, nearly falling herself. Frank stumbled, rifle slipping from his numb hands. Storm barreled through the drift, driving the foals onto the frozen creek. His scream echoed through the gorge like thunder. For a breath, Frank dared to believe they might outrun the fire, the men, the night itself. Then gunfire. Bullets cracked against the canyon wall, splintering ice. Sarah ducked, dragging Frank down. The foals shrieked, scattering across the frozen stream. Storm whirled, teeth bared, facing the ridge where torches now burned from above. More men, more guns. They were surrounded. Stories like Frank Harris and the wounded stallion Storm remind us that life's greatest battles are not always fought on open fields with medals to show, but in the quiet corners of our own existence against loneliness, fear, and the temptation to give up when the weight grows too heavy. At its heart, this tale is about resilience, an aging veteran scarred by war and time, standing in the freezing Montana wilderness, refusing to abandon creatures more fragile than himself. It is about courage that does not roar, but whispers, "I will not yield, not tonight." The story also carries the timeless lesson of trust. A wild stallion, untamed and wounded, chooses to follow the call of survival into the hands of a man who himself feels broken. Their bond becomes a mirror, one creature finding strength in another, proving that healing often comes not from retreating into solitude, but from opening ourselves to connection. For our own lives, the message is clear. Adversity will find us. Loss, betrayal, or even the isolation of aging can make the world feel merciless. Yet, the presence of loyalty, whether from animals, friends, or unexpected allies, reminds us that no one is truly meant to carry their burden alone. Finally, the story warns us of greed and the forces that prey upon innocence, yet assures us that integrity and compassion are weapons strong enough to resist. It asks us, what would you protect, even when the cost is unbearable? In answering, we discover what matters most in our lives. This is not just a horse story, it is a reflection of the human spirit's stubborn will to fight for dignity, for trust, and for the chance to belong.